discussion, which is about Jewish languages and the problem of translation, of course, particularly when it comes to liturgy. My name is Maeera Shreiber, and I teach at the University of Utah, and there's wonderful resumes in that, so I'm not going to go into our resume so much. Mine. I'm going to tell you quickly who's here. This is Dr. Joseph Rothstein, who is the creator. Rosenstein. I love his Siddur, but I don't pronounce his name properly. Rosenstein, who is the creator and publisher of Eight Ratzon, which is a traditional and amazingly innovative Siddur. Joel Rosenberg, who is the primary translator for Kol Neshama. Rabbi Ofer, Shabat Beit-Halachmi, who is, I will say, a paitan, someone who writes liturgy in Hebrew, and Dr. Rabbi Leila Berner, who is a Reconstructionist rabbi. Berner. And
it's actually Rosenberg.
Translation here. Very funny. And she too is a paitanit, a liturgist. The question when Dan invited me to participate and talk about translation, or to invite all of us to talk about translation, I thought there's probably no more urgent issue really in liturgy today. Translation is just simply fascinating from a theoretical point, but there's active concerns as we think about the people with whom we daven and the range of ways they are comfortable or not comfortable with Hebrew. So the question I asked a host of questions, but I suppose to begin with, simply is translation, reading tefillah or davening in translation, is it always a liability or is it ever an asset? So maybe that'll be something that we'll pick up, but I've asked everybody to speak 5 or 7 minutes or so, and then there'll be questions, but not questions by raising your hand. Instead, all questions will be submitted either on index cards or by email. Now let's start.
Okay, may I have the microphone there? Okay, so as mentioned, is this on? Yes? Yes. As mentioned, I'm the editor, compiler, translator. Sometimes I even call myself the author of this Siddur, although I'm not, because the prayers in the Siddur are relatively traditional. This is Siddur 8 Ratzon, looks like this. And there's a subsequent Machzor 8 Ratzon, which looks like that too, except it's a different color. For many years before I started translating the Siddur, I had been giving courses related to prayer. And I always asked the students in my classes what made it difficult for them to pray. What were their obstacles to prayer? And in preparing the Siddur, I tried to address those obstacles, to help people overcome those obstacles. Now, some of those obstacles did not have to do with translation, but I will mention that the Siddur has a complete transliteration because many people can't read Hebrew. The Siddur and Machzor have guidelines as to what's going on these pages here, because many people just don't know what's going on. It does have meditations because many people want to go beyond the prayers and get some of the spiritual insights in the prayers. And it does have some new prayers, but I won't talk about any of those because I'm going to focus on the translation issues that I addressed. One of the most commonly mentioned obstacles was the references to God as male. That was very easy to address in my translation by simply referring to God always in the second person. Since you in English is gender neutral, that solves the problem. But is that a legitimate solution from a traditional perspective? Well, what I found was that in the Psalms, God is referred to frequently in the second person, And indeed, references to God in the Psalms seamlessly switch back and forth between second and third person. So the next time you chant Psalm 145, Ashrei, which starts out there on the wall, serendipitously, count the number of times count the number of alternations between God being referred to in the second person and the number of times that God is referred to in the second and the third person. You'll be amazed how many switches there are, and no one ever notices them because they sound perfectly okay. Another consequence of using you instead of he is that the distance between us and God is decreased, so that prayer automatically becomes more personal. I'm told that when the King James Version of the Bible was written, the word thou was a more personal pronoun than you. And only later did the two words switch meanings so that thou became more formal, and so when people read the King James Version, they see it as God being very distant. A second type of objection was philosophical, that there are a number of key concepts that are deal breakers for many people. The solution for that was to give people permission in the translation and in the commentaries to have different views, to acknowledge that not all Jews hold fast to the traditional view of life after death, chosenness, restoration of sacrifices, and just because you don't subscribe to the traditional beliefs, you don't have to abandon prayer and abandon Judaism. That also meant providing alternative language for some of the prayers, as other Siddurim had already done. Another important deal breaker for many people, which I was not aware of but learned about, was Unatana Tokef in the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur prayers, which, by suggesting that your fate in life is a consequence of your actions, is theologically Calvinistic and psychologically a blame-the-victim approach to human suffering. A third category of obstacles that people indicated to prayer was language itself. That is, that the translation of many passages in the Siddurim did not shed light on the meaning of the Hebrew for the modern reader. While many people like to pray in a Hebrew that they don't understand, so that they can avoid grappling with what the prayers mean, there are also many who want to know and understand what they are saying. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." What does that phrase mean? And what about "for his name's sake"? I think that the meaning of the opening lines of this psalm is better expressed as follows. A song of David. "With you as my shepherd, Adonai, I have everything I need. You provide me food from lush pastures. You lead me to drink from peaceful waters. You restore my soul when I'm in distress. You provide me guidance and direction, because that's what a shepherd does." I was a little bit disturbed at this morning's session on poetry because there was a sense among some of the speakers that the traditional metaphors no longer apply. I have never seen a shepherd. I have no idea what the life of a shepherd is like, and I suspect that most of you are in the same category, but that paragraph is very meaningful to me nevertheless. One aspect of early Hebrew is that it is lacking words for concepts that are now in everyday use. For example, in the prayer just before the Shema, there's the phrase, "V'yached levavenu ahava u'liyira et shemecha," which is usually translated as "unify our hearts to love and revere, awe, fear your name." Unify our hearts. That didn't ring a bell to me until I thought that, well, we would express it this way. We would say, "May we integrate our understanding of you so that we love and revere you simultaneously." A fourth obstacle that people have mentioned is that the translations of the prayers are too literal and so don't convey in English the messages that appear in the Hebrew. When possible, I translated each word literally, but sometimes I would translate whole phrases, sometimes sentences, and sometimes even paragraphs, so as to better convey their meaning to the modern reader, rather than focus on the individual words. A good example of a prayer which is sort of backwards is Ya'aleh v'Yavo. So those of you who know it will recognize that you don't learn about the theme of it until the very end. And that's sort of not the way we like to read things in English. So my translations are not always literal. If they diverge substantially, I point that out and often give the literal translation in the commentary column. I also try to maintain the flow of the Hebrew in the translation. Not always, but much of the time, so that the prayers become as davenable in English as in Hebrew. And I thought that was an important thing. The last obstacle I want to address is repetition. So many people find parts of the prayers difficult because there's a lot of repetition there. And so I want to take one example and talk about it a little bit. Following the Shema in the morning service, there is a list of 14 adjectives. Emet, v'yatziv, v'nachon, v'kayam, and you can fill in the rest if you know it, and if you don't, that's okay. 14 adjectives, count them all in a row. That's not how we talk today, and such lists don't resonate with those in today's service at all. It's sort of not surprising that people feel that the prayers have no relevance to them when they read them, and it just doesn't sound like something that's appropriate for them. Years ago, when I led guided meditations, I discovered that the authors of many of the prayers recorded their personal experiences in the prayers. Of course, their words were inadequate to capture that spiritual experience. Even more so for people living worlds away from the authors, worlds in both space and time. Often they expressed their insight in a list of words. The goal of my meditations years ago was to recapture what I saw as the wow experience of these spiritual masters. They tried to write them down in their language, and that's not our language. So I tried to convey that in my translations. Let me continue with that example. The service leader signals that it's time for the congregation to move to the next paragraph by reading aloud the closing lines of the previous paragraph, except at the end of the Shema. The third paragraph of the Shema closes with the phrase, Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am Adonai your God. But the leader recites, Adonai Elohechem Emet, which means Adonai is your God, and that is true. Dropping the Ani completely changes the meaning of the phrase. And perhaps it was the person who first made that change who realized the effect of that change. So here's how I tried to convey that in my translation. Adonai is your God, and that is true. Wow, this teaching is so amazing, I cannot find enough words to describe it. It is definitely true and always will be. It provides reliable direction to my life. I love it. It is dear and precious and pleasant to me. It is awesome and powerful. It is sweet and beautiful. It is true. You are the eternal ruler, and you are our God. You are the rock of Jacob, and you are the shield that saves us. So I have more to say, but my time must be up. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel, and I hope that my remarks shed some light on the challenge of translating the traditional prayers for today's davener. By the way, of course, you can see copies of the Siddur and the Machzor at the display table downstairs or at the website newsiddur.org.
Thank you. As you can see, my papers are spread out all over because the mind is spread out all over. Yes, I have not prepared anything formal for today, but I thought maybe I could talk through a few translations I've done, but both within and without the Siddur, and mostly without the Siddur. Actually, I wanted to begin it, since we are now in the countdown to the holiday of Shavuot, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. I wanted to read a passage which, in a way, addresses the whole problem of translatability, and it includes a very radical theory of how the Torah reached the nations of the world. which in many ways was probably not part of rabbinic theology, but was kind of added by a medieval storyteller. This is from a work called the Midrash on the Ten Commandments, written by an author who engaged in many bawdy tales and a lot of stuff that can't be said in synagogues in polite company. But he begins it with this exquisite, which is based partly on Shemot Rabbah and partly on maybe on other sources. But it's an explanation of the first commandment: I am Hashem, your God. I am the Creator, your God. And I'm going to have to wing it here because this was in the era before I discovered that God is not the male pronoun. So I'm going to be modifying his's throughout. When it emerged from the mouth of the Blessed Holy One, may its name be exalted. Bolts of lightning, divinity, may its name be exalted. Bolts of lightning and thunder issued from God. Firebrands on its right and its left. And in that hour no human being breathed, no bird chirped, no lion roared, no cattle lowed, no ass brayed. The world seemed uninhabited. And the word went forth from the mouth of the Blessed Holy One, and went like someone walking about in the world. The divine speech turned into 70 languages for all the world to hear. There are by now 6,000 world languages. As it is said, all of the kings of the earth shall praise you, O Ancient One, for they have heard the words you spoke. When Israel heard the divine speech, they were knocked back 12 miles, and the Israelites' souls departed from them. As it is said, I was faint because of what God said. Song of Songs. Torah said before God, Sovereign of the universe, to whom would you give me, the living or the dead? God said to her, to the living. She said before him, Master of the universe, look, they're all dead. God said to her, I will revive them. As it is said, you released a bountiful rain, O God. When your own land languished, you sustained it. Psalm 68. But the Israelites were still unable to stand upon their feet, and the Holy Blessed One sent to each and every one of Israel 2 angels, one to lay its hand upon one's heart so that one's soul would not depart, and the other one to lift its head up to its Creator. And the Holy One, the Blessed One, gave permission and ability for them to look upon God, and God's voice went out and traveled around to each one's ears and said to them, will you receive yourselves, upon yourselves, the Torah, which has in its 248 positive commandments? And the Israelites answered yes. And the speech came forth again from God's mouth and went around to each one's ears and said, will you receive upon yourself the Torah, which has in it 365 negative commandments? And the Israelites answered yes. And the divine speech reemerged from the ear and kissed them upon their mouths, as it is said, O give me the kisses of your mouth. Whereupon the Blessed Holy One opened up for them the 7 heavens, the 7 layers of the deep, and the 7 layers of the earth, and they saw each with its own eyes, each one with one's own eyes, that there was none other than God. And God said to them, see now that I am the one, and there is no God beside me. I deal death and give life. I wounded and I will heal. In a session I was in yesterday, we got around to talking about Psalm 23. How much more time do I have? 5? Okay. A number of hackles had gotten raised by the translation among some people about the translation of Psalm 23. And for the record, I wanted to just share a version which is not in Kol HaNeshama. I thought of it afterward. This is one of those things, if I had to do it over again, I would do it this way. And it preserves a lot of the same language, but maybe a few nuances different. And it goes like this. It's a poem called The House of Divine Love. The Eternal is my shepherd, I shall never be in need. In choicest meadows God has made my bed. By calmest waters God has guided me, and it restores my soul. God sets me down upon the surest pathways in service to the divine name. Even should I walk into a valley of the darkest shadows, I shall fear no evil. You are with me there. Your strength and your support, they comfort me. Surely good and loving kindness shall pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell inside the house of divine love as long as time shall be. A third text is one that was talked about in the session that David Teutsch addressed in yesterday. He mentioned sort of the complicated history of getting Shir HaKavod into the Siddur. And it turned out that they were ready, the Prayer Book Commission ahead of time, prefab, were ready to jettison it from the Siddur. And somehow I got started on translating it. Maybe I misunderstood the expectations or something, and I started working on it. And is Rena Spicehandler here? I was. Oh, okay. So I was told in retrospect that Rena was the one who encouraged me, and very likely, I'm indebted to her for so much, encouraged me to finish that work, finish that translation. So, and this was, for me, just an incredibly liberating experience because I got to do something I had rarely ever done before, which was be a rhyming poet, to be an acrostic poet, and to do so in a kind of singing meter. Actually, for me, meter is Shakespearean meter, which is not native Hebrew, or for that matter, especially not medieval Hebrew meter. If you want to see examples of the latter, go into the published works of Raymond Scheindlin, who has done extraordinary work on the medieval piyut and on even secular poems of the Jews of Spain. But he does a real metric translation. I had taken an acting class when I was 14 years old, a nighttime professional acting class, in which for the first hour or so we had elocution lessons, and some of that involved reading Shakespeare. So reading iambic meter of Shakespeare, I got to think along the way all about that kind of meter. And I wrote my first book on the Bible, King and Kin, in iambic meter for the most part. But in any case, it's in my head, and when I translate, I instinctively reach for it. And this went into Shir HaKavod. And I guess there's a drawback to this, which I'll talk about in a minute. These melodies I sing, now weaving lines of song, for only for your presence does my spirit sorely long. My soul desires nothing but your hand's protective shield, to know all secret paths within the mystery that is sealed. Each time I speak of glory in this world or above, my heart is full of longing for your friendship and your love. Therefore, I only speak of you with glory singer's tongue. I glorify your name with songs that those in love have sung. And then it begins the acrostic part. And so I tell, Aleph, and so I tell your glory, yet never have seen you. Imagine you, find names for you, yet never have known you. By hand of those who prophesied and throngs who worshipped you, you gave imagination to the glory beyond view. God's greatness now unfolding, your might beyond all needs, they found the names foretelling of the power of your deeds. Denoting you with likenesses, though less than you by far, they simply have equated what you've done with who you are. One more stanza. Here's parable and proverb and endless visions sung, and yet beyond all imagery, behold, you are one. With age you now appear to some a youngster fair. Each person tells the whiteness or the blackness of your hair, and so on. You can read all the way to Tav and beyond. I think I'll pause and hand the microphone on, but later I want to read something quite extraordinary, a poem that was sent to me by a poet friend he writes circles around anyone who writes poetry, as far as I'm concerned. I think it belongs in this session and maybe another session too. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
You will use that? Or
I will try to use that one.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to start with apologizing that I'm speaking in a second language, and I need to deal with this matter of translation constantly and simultaneously, and And it brings me into understanding about the differences in languages and differences in the nature and the culture that the languages were born and live in. I want to comment about two aspects that seems to be contradict. One is about the prayer itself, and the other about the language of prayer and the translation. And why is that? Because I'm not a translator myself, but when I think about prayer, when I am practicing prayer, when I relate to prayer, I find a very interesting process, or let's call it process. It's not a process, but let's call it just in the word prayer. The prayer is trying to give words to something that is beyond words. And as much as I understand, the prayer that is in the prayer book, in the Siddur, is already the third level of translation. The first translation is between the eternity, the holy, this, that, it thing that have no words and we can't explain and we want to touch. So the first transformation or interpretation or translation is between the no words into an inner feeling, inner understanding, inner dialogue that we are processing within ourselves. So it's even before the language itself. It's the touch between the Kodesh and the Chol, the Kedusha and the human, or our world. So this is the first part of translation that each one of us, I think, well, I do, is trying to reach when we are praying. The second translation is between this amorphic human feelings or experience into a language, into our personal words. The third translation will be to bring it out into the Siddur. So the Siddur is already the third level of translation in this process. Between the inner human experience of tefillah and the Siddur, there is also the gap between the personal and the communal, right? The words in the Siddur are words that are in print, that many people use in different ways, and it's also a level of transformation, not translation, but transformation. Once we said that, I would describe prayer as a process of translation that have also a second part, which is to take the words in the Siddur and to bring it in again, and to see and to understand how it relates to the inner dialogue and the inner words that we already have been processed. That meeting, that it's not a dialogue anymore. It's many voices, many words that added into this prayer is what I call prayer. So the prayer to be short, is a translation, a back and forth translation, out and in of a person.
Ratzov Ashov.
Ratzov Ashov, exactly. Ratzov Ashov. Im chayot, im harbe chayot. So, if we take this definition or this idea, we will find that we need to renew our words and our prayer books and our prayers and our liturgy constantly, because it's dynamic. It's part of life. And it's a meeting between the individual and the communal. So it needs to be updated constantly and to be very creative. I think Mordechai Kaplan, our rabbi that brought us here together with his servant, Dan, through his shaliach, malach. He understood the need for creativity in this spiritual life. So this is the first part of the thing that I wanted to comment about. The second half, do I have another 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. That will be easy. The second half is about the contradict process. The contradict process is, I will tell you a story. On the way here, we drove through Pennsylvania, and we watched this huge windmills that transformers, electricity generators that using the wind to create or translate this energy into kinetic energy, and the kinetic energy into electric energy, and the electric energy coming into this building, and the air condition brings us new wave of wind, of cold wind, to change the atmosphere here, right? And it's always too cold or too hot to anybody, right? In the prayer book, how would you translate that? It's too cold or too hot always, and okay. Thanks God for the air condition. And the AC is the translation. Because the big wind, haruach, the wind, the natural wind that we are not controlling, it comes from the creation of the world. The natural wind, which is not just wind. It's a lot of things. One small thing is to move this huge windmills, but this is just tiny part of what wind is. Becoming, after time and space, the wind that comes through our AC fans. So, as I see it, and I hope that I will not be stoned for that, that the Hebrew is the wind of our Jewish civilization. If we will use translation for prayer, or actually for our Jewish life, what kind of Jewish civilization we left of that? This is the source of life of our Jewish civilization. And for somebody that lived all his life in a block in Upper West Side of New York, I think when somebody will write a poem relate to the AC fan, it will be fascinating and it will be very acceptable. But in our Jewish civilization, if we will write about the fan, where the wind will go to. And I will, to conclude my words, I will just say that ruach, the word ruach, wind, that I will translate into wind or something else. What was the translation? How to translate the word from Hebrew, ruach. What is ruach? Ruach is a direction, north, east, west. This is the word ruach. Ruach is soul. Ruach is spirit. Ruach is wind. Ruach is also courage. So what we will lose, what depth of words, of culture, of language that is 4,500 and maybe another years old. That's will conclude my words.
Wonderful, thank you.
It's so beshert that I come after you. Because everything you said, I agree with, and part of what you said, I respectfully disagree with.
Thank you.
Good, a conversation.
A wonderful
Perfect.
conversation. Mordechai Kaplan loved Achad Ha'am, who was the great voice of cultural Judaism and spiritual cultural Judaism. And he believed that the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the culture of Israel would be the hub of a great wheel. And from that hub, sparks of creativity and culture would generate and emanate out to all the lands of the Jewish diaspora. And Mordechai Kaplan differed with him in one essential way. He said that the lands of the Jewish diaspora had their own hubs. And from those hubs, energy and creativity and sparks would fly that would not only be for those lands, but they would also return and emanate and radiate back to the mothership, to the homeland of Eretz Yisrael. I give that example because one of the few things that I disagreed with you about was your last point. I believe that, and I said this yesterday as well, I believe that Mamaloshin comes in many forms. That Hebrew is one, Yiddish is one, Ladino is one, English is one, Spanish is one, wherever Jews are. So one of the points, it wasn't my first one, but I'll start there now. One of the points that I want to make today is that translation can be an obstacle when it is either not resonant, and that's one issue, or when the language of the translation is the language of the place, it is the vernacular, but it doesn't have cadence, it doesn't have rhythm, it doesn't have tone, it doesn't have all those things that allow us to daven with it. It doesn't have all those things that give us the beauty of praying in Hebrew. And one of my greatest teachers, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Zichrono Livracha, was pioneering a way in which we could use English, the Mamaloshin of the Jewish communities of this continent, to do just that. To be able to daven in English so that it felt natural, so that it felt heartfelt, so that the words were ones we understood and that we could daven in. Not exclusively, not even in terms of a majority of the time, but as I said yesterday, that there would be a synthetic, a kind of synthesis, a way of weaving together both Hebrew and English, so there was a kind of seamless way of davening in both. Now, I hadn't planned on doing this, but Maeera asked me yesterday if I would give it an example. Now, this is Nusach America. It's not Nusach Israel. It's not Nusach Argentina. It's Nusach America. I had planned to do it with Kol Hanshama, and then I realized that we would be here at Rodef Shalom, and I don't have a copy of Kol Hanshama, which is what we daven with in my shul. I took Reb Zalman's Shema, a concise weekday Siddur for praying in English. And just this morning, I took a little section of it, Birkot HaShachar, the morning prayers. And I want to give you a short example. When we daven the morning prayers in Hebrew, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan l'sichri vina lavchin ben yom u'ben laila. I offer you thanks, cosmic majesty, life of all the worlds, for giving me the gift to discern the difference between darkness and light. I offer you thanks, cosmic majesty, life of all the worlds, for giving me the gift of sight. I offer you thanks, cosmic majesty, life of all the worlds, for giving freedom of movement to my body. I could continue. This is not so unnatural. It's not so foreign. It's not so alien. And for a community who begins to feel those rhythms, it can feel like Mamaloshen, and it can feel very much like part of our tradition. Again, not to the exclusion of the Hebrew, but to a partnership and a connection with the Hebrew. In my shul, we do both. We do the Hebrew, we do the English, sometimes together, sometimes separately, sometimes in a cacophony. Feels sometimes like a shtibel in Europe. But I think that there is definitely a place for davening those words. And again, I want to say this with great gratitude to Joel, that Joel's poetic translation in some places, and particularly in those kinds of places, really works because we can daven it and feel the beauty of the English words. In communal prayer, cadence and tone and rhythm make a huge difference. In personal prayer, I believe that there's a whole other set of challenges that translation brings us. Resonance, imagery. For example, what do we do with the lead up to the Kedusha? Va'ofanim v'chayot HaKodesh, the holy creature, the chariot and the holy creatures of the heavens. Does that resonate for non-mystical Jews? Does that resonate for most people coming to read that translation? It's a beautiful translation. But does that work for most of us who don't read Hebrew, who don't understand Hebrew, who look on the right side of the page and are trying to understand what this is all about? Do we translate that with imagery that for Ofanim and Chayot HaKodesh that evoke imagery of magnificent stars and comets and celestial displays of light and so on? It's not a translation, but it's an evocation. Do we do that? Or do we begin to think rather radically of substituting imagery that is more resonance? And I understand the dangers of that. I definitely understand the dangers of that. But do the words speak to the hearts of those who are praying? Are they too formal to be resonant? Are they not formal enough? While still being faithful to the Hebrew, do they speak Bilshon B'nei Adam? Do they speak in the language of human beings? And then I also understand that perhaps, and I really resonated with what you said, that Tefillah in some level is not Lashon B'nei Adam. Tefillah is not the language, ordinary language. It is the difference between Chol and Kadosh. It is the difference between holiness and ordinary. So part of this is how do we draw the balance between what is holy and what is ordinary, and how do we find the golden mean? How do we find the meeting point? But I do believe that translation needs to be evocative, and evocative not only of the high places, but also of the places that we live, the places that touch our kishkas. And I don't think we've reached that yet. I know we haven't reached that. In a very interesting book that I just recently have been reading called "And God Said, How Translations Conceal the Bible's Original Meaning," Joel Hoffman argues for accuracy in biblical translation, but for liturgy, he says, and I'm now quoting him, "I think that accuracy should be subservient to prayerfulness. What good is an accurate translation at a prayer service if it doesn't make for good prayer?" What he means by this, I think, is that a translation that feels archaic and out of date, out of step with the times and the people, is not a good prayer and therefore not useful. And the example he gives is the 23rd Psalm. He says, "For most people, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," may sound like elegant English, but it doesn't mean a whole lot to a lot of people, other than it's resonant from funerals. And that's not even our language, it's King James. It's the language of King James. So I would agree with Dr. Hoffman, and that is why when Kol Hanshama was first published, I lauded your translation, Joel, because it was so close to the original and yet so beautifully poetic. But as time went on, and I've now been using the book from the day that it was published, as time went on, I was told by my congregants that the translation, though elegant, did not enhance their understanding of the Hebrew or their experience of prayer. They enjoyed it for itself as wonderful poetry, but not as a tool for prayer. One fairly typical comment was, "Rabbi, the handouts you bring in with poems or readings that evoke the prayer's connection to our own lives is better than the actual translation." So I want to give you one example. You may like this poem, you may not like this poem. Some of you may find it wonderful, and some of you may find it to be not a great poem at all. I want to set it up though. I want to say to you that this poem didn't just come into our liturgy that day with no preparation. It came after more than 2 years of study sessions, conversations, davening about the Song of the Sea, the crossing of the Reed Sea, and what that meant for our people in biblical times and what it might mean for us on a much more personal, inner transformative level. And my community now understands and really conceives of the crossing of the sea, both in its national meaning for our people and as a personal leap of faith moment where we can personally transform our lives by jumping into a sea and self-liberating for many things. So they were already there when I introduced this poem. It's called Cold Feet. And I'm sorry I can't tell you who the poet is, because in the Siddur in which I found it, which is from Congregation Sha'ar Zahav in San Francisco, it's listed as anonymous. They say cold feet are a sign of turning back, the failure of internal will. But I say it can be the other way, the body's anticipation of things to come, whether demons are nipping at your heels or gnawing within. Here's the thing: settle quietly, close your eyes, then take the most deliberate, deep breath, as though it were the very first, God's breath. And when you can feel it penetrate every bit of your being, making the rest of your life possible, you open your eyes and take that first step out into the sea of reeds. Watered feet are just the price of coming home. I would submit to you that a poem like that sometimes is worth so much more than celestial images that don't work for people like you and people like me in the daily grist of our lives. And I believe that a poem like this can be woven into our davening in ways that do not diminish one iota of the Kodesh of our Hebrew or of our liturgical tradition, because along with that, every time I read from the morning liturgy, Ilu finu maleh shira kayam, were our mouths like the song of the sea, and our feet as swift as the deer, we could not thank you for the thousands upon thousands of goodnesses that you have given to us. From the traditional liturgy, I am thrilled each time. One woven together with another is sheer beauty and can inspire the heart in amazing ways. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop there.
Do we have questions? Wait,
I
just,
actually
we're
wanted to
gonna,
respond to this.
wonder whether or not we'll have time to respond. I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm not getting email, so do it. All right. So, Joseph, this is for you. When you translate a word, phrase, sentence, or paragraph freely, for example, the Ya'aleh v'Yavo, are you tempted to rewrite the Hebrew too? What stops you? Why should those who read the Hebrew be denied your interpretation and sensitivity to modern understanding?
I'll need a microphone for that.
All right?
No, the microphone right there. Sure. So, one decision I made relatively early in the process was that I would not try to rewrite the Hebrew. As many of you know, there was a very large-scale project to rewrite the Hebrew so that it would not be masculine-oriented the way it is now. And that took a substantial number of years to do. I figured that trying to rewrite the Hebrew was not my derech. That was not the way that I wanted to go. I wanted to make the texts accessible mainly to people who are not strong Hebrew readers necessarily. So I didn't do that. There were some places, of course, where I felt that alternate readings should be inserted, and I did that. There were a few places here or there where I felt that changes should be made, because I just thought that nobody else is going to do it, so that I would. So, for example, when it says, B'tzeit Yisrael b'Mitzrayim Beit Yaakov me'am lo ez, that's the second paragraph, Hallel, am la'ez has no meaning, but if you move the lamed from la'ez to am, it becomes Beit Yaakov me'amal az, that the children of Israel were rescued from excessive work, let's say. So I made that change, although I offered to people to say the regular one. So I did make small changes here and there, but the kind of change which would be necessary in order to implement the changes that I made in English, to implement those in Hebrew, would be too great, and I didn't feel that compelled to do that. I'm going to take the opportunity, since several people have mentioned translating things so that they sound the same as in English as in Hebrew, to chant something, which I do at great peril because I am not the best, as the people in my minyan know. I do not have the best voice, but you will certainly recognize what this is. Before we begin to read the account of our revelation, please give me permission for a small oration. Just 2 or 3 words, no more will I take, to praise the Creator who everything did make, etc. So that, of course, is a translation of the first few lines of Akdamut, which we read on the first day of Shavuot. And I too tried to translate, for example, as you did Shira Kavod, in such a way that it would have the same kind of rhythm as the Hebrew, so that people could participate in chanting it. Even if they couldn't do the Hebrew, they could chant the English instead, and that would achieve the same objective. So I answered that question and something else, so I used up my time.
Thank you. This question is interesting. So I'll ask the question and then I'll tell you why I think it's interesting. What is the meaning, and I think this is probably for you, Joel, though others of you might have ideas, of you shall prepare a table before my enemies in Psalm 23. And the reason I find it interesting is it seems to bring with it the expectation of translation as explication and as a way of bringing that which is far away a little bit closer. And I was very taken by your image of the ruach, right? The wind before we have harvested it. And wondering whether or not translation invites us to have that understanding of absolute understanding tefillah, and whether or not there's a way to keep that sense of utter mystery and not understanding and standing in the wind, full on face, even when it's in English. So that's a meta question, but maybe someone wants to first explain the image.
Well, let me do 2 things. One is I want to respond to this question about Psalm 23, and the other is I want to respond to your wonderful remarks and about the dilemma of translating that I had. I want basically to read, and thank you for introducing Reb Zalman into this forum. I wanted to read his translation of Psalm 23 from his final book, I think, perhaps, Psalms for Translating.
I just want to say that on the day that he passed away, the first thing that we did was we listened to a video of him reading his translation in his
lovely.
own voice.
Well, it's an amazing book, and actually I wrote a blurb on the back of it in any case. He goes like this: Yah, my shepherd, you supply my needs. I don't ever feel deprived. You feed me in the meadows. I am led to quench my thirst by a quiet stream. You stir my soul and guide me gently through the thicket of right action. Such is your fame. At times I must make my way through dark and dangerous gullies, but because you are with me, I won't panic if I have to face evil. And here's a key line: both your rebuke and your bracing support give me comfort. In the presence of adversity, you set me a feast at which my anxious head is soothed and my thirst is amply slaked. I love that. Because you have invited me, I affirm that only goodness and graciousness will manifest for the rest of my life, in which I will always be at home with you.
So that very much answers the question, or because it's translation as explication.
I think so, yes. And the 2 readings that I gave of my own translations before, I was trying to basically highlight, I meant to give a summary at the end of what I meant by reading those, was that it embodies a theory of translation, and it's also about dealing with the remoteness of God and the intimacy of God, and both have to be comprehended in a way. And can I Just say a
Well,
little-
I think we've got some other questions.
Oh, okay.
So is that all right?
Okay.
Leila, someone has a question about your comments about Kaplan and Echad Ha'am. Since, as you know, the logo that Kaplan created for the Reconstructionist movement was in fact put Zion at the center of a single wheel. And I'm wondering whether or not you want to connect a little bit more.
Sure. Kaplan was an ardent Zionist, there's no question about it, and he saw Zion at the center of the wheel. However, he always taught that each Jewish community had not only intrinsic value for the people within it, he also believed very, very strongly that each Jewish community of the Jewish diaspora had intrinsic value for the other communities and for Zion itself. And that without the Jewish, as much as he was a Zionist, and a very, very ardent one, he never believed that all Jews should or could or should live in the land of Israel. And that there was a cross-fertilization that occurred with Jews in the Jewish diaspora that would enrich Israel, and that Israel, in the same way, would enrich the diaspora. I would think that in that he was very prescient, in that nowadays, many Jews from the diaspora who are making aliyah do so not only because they love the people and the state of Israel, but because dafka, they believe that they have a perspective and wisdom to bring to the land of Israel that will offer tikkun, that will offer repair and healing to the people and to the state of Israel. Now that may sound like hubris, but I don't think so. I think it's a sense of family, a sense of connection, a sense of we're all in this together, and perspectives from outside of Israel sometimes can inform and offer healing perspectives that will make a big difference. So I think if Kaplan were here, I think he would agree with that.
Leila, this question that's just come in is a beautiful extension of your comments. Someone asks whether any of our panelists have strong feelings about whether or not native Hebrew speakers and non-native Hebrew speakers experience prayer differently.
I would say certainly yes. I would say the difference is that I'm not a native Hebrew speaker, but I'm pretty close, having spent more than a decade of my life in Israel. And when I look at the Hebrew on the page, I rarely look at the English translation, I do have to say, but when I look at the Hebrew, what comes out at me is not only translation. What comes out at me is that ruach. What comes out are the imagery, the poetry, the way the words are crafted together, and I'm constantly in awe of its beauty and its intricacy, and how did they possibly come out with that combination of words in that way to evoke the kind of imagery that's there? That a non-native Hebrew speaker who doesn't have that level of proficiency in the language doesn't get there.
May I
Please.
comment? It's obvious that each person pray differently, not just according to the geographical or Mamaloshan, how do you call it? Mother tongue. But if we are asking not only the individual spiritual question, but also that we are part of Jewish civilization, or Jewish community, or Judaism, or to be Jewish in Gimel, or in Yud, is something else. And if we will lose our ability to speak And speak with God is also a way of speaking. But speaking with the community and speaking with our texts and our scriptures, if we will lose this ability, and the process is going on, we will lose the foundations of our culture, in the meaning of Jewish as a civilization. I just want to put cosmic majesty and Elohim side by side, right? I can pray as a person, as an individual, with cosmic majesty, or as Kaplan pray to whom may concern, right?
He never prayed to whom it may concern. That's a myth. He never did.
I'm just kidding, but it's not a myth that he prayed while reading Echad Ha'am. Okay.
No,
So there are
that's
different ways to pray, but when I say the word Elohim, it's something totally different with the depth of the meaning, because to say Elohim is what? How will you translate Elohim? There is no translation to the word Elohim. And why? Because Elohim is in plural. How can you say one gods, the one and only gods? So what does the word Elohim want to tell us when this is our the name of the only God? It wants to tell us that we can't say God. We can relate to God in one word at all. But it says also something else. What is El? El is a name of an idol. It's not God. It's the opposite of our God. So to say Elohim, it's in plural, and it contains an idol in it. El. And what is this idol, El? El, Aleph, Lamed, it's two letters, Hebrew letters, that it's in original comes to represent the cattle, the ox, the calf. These two words, two letters. Sorry, I can't explain now why, but it's part of the transformation from symbols to language. So when I say Elohim, I remember that I'm saying a word that represents the opposite of idolatry. I don't say the name God. I don't say God. I say, I'm praying to you, the opposite of idolatry. That's what it says, Elohim.
So
And not just the opposite of idolatry. It's our first scene while we receive the Torah in a week. We will receive the Torah, and we have the scene of the golden calf, which is there. So while saying Elohim, I have the depth of 4,400 years of language that absorb into this word. How can you say cosmic majesty? And no, it's fine. I'm not joking about cosmic majesty. It is a divine way to pray, but for me, it's way far from speaking the Jewish language of prayer.
So I'd like to just make a comment on that. Certainly, if someone is steeped in Hebrew language and is steeped in Jewish history and in all the kinds of things that we're talking about, there is the potential for being able to pray in a different way than someone for whom all of this is strange. However, I want to tell you one story about myself, and that is that in writing a translation of the Siddur, I was constantly amazed by the fact that I had said these prayers perhaps 10,000 times, and in some occasions I had no idea what they meant. It was only when I had to translate the Siddur that I had to translate every word, every phrase, every sentence, every paragraph, that I was forced to figure out what that phrase, words, sentence, paragraph meant. And I realized that for most people, including those who are well steeped in the Hebrew language and well steeped in Jewish history and culture, for most people, I would guess that most of the Siddur is not something that is clear to them. They are words that are said, and often nothing more. So the person who comes to this from a fresh start may in fact surpass the person who has the background in Hebrew and Jewish tradition and culture that you mentioned.
Thank you. So as I suspected, we should have just had a whole conference on translation and liturgy. But thank you so much for being here. No, it was good. It was good. Ta-da.
Everyone downstairs to the basement again.
No, but it worked out.